John hadn't seen me for a month when all of a sudden he pushed the business card of a divorce lawyer at me without even asking how I was or if I was alright with divorcing a non-working wife as alimony. Give me $1,000 per month, sounds excellent. John laughed and stood next to Emily, who put her arm around him, both of them sporting smug looks. Take care, John said. I nonchalantly answered, fine, let's divorce then, startling John for a second before he smiled and grinned at Emily. It's a good thing John doesn't think very much, it facilitates the execution of my plan. I made the decision to start my revenge plot on them both as soon as the divorce papers were approved, with the intention of making them cry in celebration of my recovery. I'm Sarah Wolf, and I'm a 47-year-old children's book author and illustrator. John and Emily, my two childhood pals, hold special meaning for me. John is my spouse. By the way, John first made the move to ask me out while I was leaving high school to attend a different institution. I was shocked since I thought he was interested in Emily, but I also couldn't resist John's revelation because I kind of liked him. I gave John's suggestion some thinking and talked it over with Emily before saying yes, even though Emily's conduct had been a little off since our adolescence. John and I still considered her a close friend, but Emily had a habit of stealing other people's relationships and then breaking them off as soon as they developed feelings for her, which repeatedly led to issues. John and I used to spend a lot of time with her to keep an eye on her since her parents were worried. John and I got married when we were 25. 4 years later, Emily brought her fiancé into our lives. His name was George, a professional working for a top-tier company. Nice to meet you, Sarah and John. I've heard so much about you, looking forward to our future together. George greeted us politely, and we all got along immediately. We would get together during holidays and vacations, taking trips or going on long train rides to enjoy some drinks. But after Emily became pregnant 2 years into her marriage, everything fell apart. At first, John and I didn't worry about having an heir because we had a large family, so we concluded that having kids wasn't necessary. Even though we both enjoyed traveling and having drinks, we weren't interested in taking on the role of a caregiver for children. Although we didn't want to follow that road, we frequently thought it was wonderful to see families with kids. John's demeanor started to change as soon as Emily revealed her pregnancy. Emily couldn't handle the stench of his smoke, so he gave up, even offering to take his vacation days to take her to doctor's visits. When I told him that George might become upset if he spends all of his time with Emily, John retaliated by calling me cold-blooded. She's our childhood friend and she's reaching out for help. He replied, you have work, don't you? I've been buying things and helping where I can, but going with her to the obstetrician is crossing the line, I said. John scowled, then gave me a mean look. He yelled, because Emily wants it, right? She claims to be nervous about the examination. I can't simply let her go by herself. It makes more sense for George to accompany her if she is nervous, doesn't it? It's almost as if you're the father of the child growing inside her if you accompany her every time, I noted. John dismissed my worries, calling me obnoxious, and without giving them much thought. Once mostly peaceful, our marriage started to become tainted with conflicts, particularly after Emily gave child. John began to spend even more time with Emma, Emily's child. Then something happened when Emma was 6 years old. The focus was on those present for Emma's graduation ceremonies. On the day preceding the graduation, John started searching through the wardrobe. What are you doing, John? I told him, you have a meeting tomorrow. Although the dress code at work was informal, John usually kept a couple suits on hand because he was required to wear a suit during client meetings. They were all tossed onto the bed now. John nonchalantly replied, just trying to decide what to wear for the graduation ceremony. What, are you really considering going to the graduation? I let forth an incredulous cry. Yes, George is unable to attend. I answered Emily's question. John said. I raised my voice in disbelief. That's absurd, no matter how You look at it, unintentionally protesting. John's expression immediately became nasty. I was aware that John would sometimes pick Emma up from kindergarten because I had also done so when asked. Still, it didn't make sense for a childhood friend who wasn't even related by blood to be present at a graduation ceremony. You still don't trust Emily and me, John said quickly. I'm disappointed that you can't even help out. Before leaving the room to go to the bedroom, with no other option, I had to give Emily a call. Emmy, hello, regarding tomorrow, will George not be annoyed about the graduation attendance? I'm borrowing John, I inquired. Sarah, what topic are you discussing? Of course, I haven't informed George that tomorrow is the graduation. After the ceremony, I'll let him know, Emily remarked breezily. The fact that George was unaware of the graduation timetable astounded me. More probing revealed that John had been taking on the role of the father figure at the kindergarten and that Emily had not told George about any of the activities that had taken place so far. I was dizzy with the selfishness of it all. Emma, hold on, isn't that totally irrational? Not only is it rude to George, but it's also because he was a boyhood friend. I started to speak, but Emily cut me off, brushing off my worries and shutting up the phone quickly. Ultimately, I finished pressing a shirt, got ready a tie, and dropped John off for Emma's graduation ceremony early the following morning. John and Emily went out more regularly after that, first once a month, then once a week, and then 3 times a week. After a while, George also appeared to be suspicious. He came to our house by himself one day when John and Emily were gone. I apologize for stopping by at such a late hour. I've been bothered by something, George said. Is it about the 2 of them? I asked. Yes, I would like you to take a look at this, George said, showing me the GPS history he had installed in Emily's car. It revealed that she had been staying at a hotel 3 times a week, coinciding with the days she was out with John. Just by looking at George's face, I understood what that meant. What do you want to do, George? I inquired. I want to take revenge on those 2, George declared. Me too. I can't forgive them for betraying us after all this time, I agreed, and together, we began secretly planning our revenge in an attempt to supplement my income. I started looking for other jobs. My salary had dropped drastically. Even though I had previously relied on savings from household chores and taking care of Emma, George had made the switch to working from home, which gave him permission to have Emma over after Emily and John left. At my residence, we would take care of her together. After that, we were able to obtain credible proof since neither Emily nor John knew that we knew about their relationship. We discovered a startling truth about Emma just when we were prepared to exact our revenge. After gathering sufficient evidence, after giving this information some thought, George and I concluded that we didn't want to hurt little Emma. Rather, we decided to wait to exact our revenge until she reached adulthood. But even though we decided to wait it out for 10 years, I developed a serious disease. I would likely not be able to leave the hospital for at least 2 years after needing long-term care. It was obvious that I would have to cut back on my workload, even if I could continue to work from my hospital room. I told George what was going on and went to John for advice. But his response was apathetic, much like our earlier small conversation. He said, I'll come see you once in a while. It was clear that John no longer cared about me because he asked no questions about how I was feeling or what ailed me. In actuality, John only came about once a month, or perhaps once every 2. Emma showed a marked change in conduct after turning 15. She came to see me nearly every day when I was first admitted to the hospital, but after she turned 15, she stopped being as close. George and I were unable to determine the cause of this change, and when we asked Emma, she simply replied, "Don't worry about it." But John, who didn't often show there, was the one who made the revelation. "Hey, it's been a while," he remarked nonchalantly as he entered, looking very glamorous. He threw the business card of a divorce attorney at me without even knocking. "How are you doing? How are you feeling?" he said without pausing to inquire. "Just putting it plainly, I want my non-working wife to pay me $1,000 a month in alimony after we get divorced. That's the bargain, so be careful," John exclaimed, beaming broadly. While Emily encircled him in an attempt to mimic his facial expression, I accepted without hesitation, seeming to surprise Jay for a little second before he swiftly grinned at Emily. Okay, let's get divorced then. Luckily, John was not the type to linger too long, which is how my strategy operated so nicely. I started my retaliation strategy against John and his wife as soon as I learned of their divorce, I decided to celebrate my recovery by making them cry. I first spoke with George to set up a transfer to the hospital. I then told my attorney that coming future, they would conduct the parties' mediation, and George moved in tandem with Emma, staying close to my new hospital and paying me regular visits. Emma's lingering sadness didn't stop me from enjoying her daily visits. I told John to get rid of the rest of my stuff as the majority was already in the hospital room. I didn't want to bring anything from their touch into my new existence. I had only been gone a short while when I was inundated with missed calls from John following the hospital transfer and George and Emma's move. With a hint of frustration, I picked up the phone and heard John's terrified voice mixed with a distraught real estate agent's voice. I was sickened by Emily's screams. "What's going on?" John made a demand, assigning blame as though he hadn't done anything wrong. With composure, I replied, "Because that's my house, John." The truth was that the house we resided in was actually a room I rented out for work. Even if John seemed to have forgotten, when I began freelancing, my income wasn't enough to maintain two houses, and John couldn't afford to live alone. Thus, he moved into my place. Consequently, John never contributed to the rent or utility bills for that room. While I received some money from him for living expenses, it fell short of covering the costs. Unfortunately, the room was already scheduled for cancellation, being far from the hospital I transferred to, so, the day after submitting the divorce papers, I processed its cancellation without informing him. The real estate agent, aware of the situation, assured me they would contact him. Suddenly, George and Emma vanished, and our house was sold. "What are we going to do about our new house?" John fretted. "I don't know. Maybe stay in a business hotel for now," I replied, turning on the speaker to resume work. John yelled in frustration, "Don't screw with me." However, he soon adopted a more soothing tone, asking when I would transfer the money, claiming they were running low on cash. "What are you talking about?" I retorted, feigning innocence. This sparked incoherent screaming from John on the other end of the line. It seemed he thought he could extract money from me despite squandering it. Even if he had $11,000 left, how did he plan to get by for the rest of the month? There's really nothing to talk about, I stated cheerfully, leaving John momentarily dumbfounded. Before his yelling resumed, I addressed John as politely as I could muster, stating, "Anyway, we're basically strangers now, so please don't contact me anymore. You'll hear from my lawyer." John tried to protest, but I hung up without listening. Despite several attempted callbacks, I ignored them, and eventually, the calls ceased. Angry that I didn't respond, John began ignoring calls from my lawyer, showcasing his childish side. I sighed deeply at John's selfishness. After being temporarily released from the hospital, I went to see John's parents a few months later. John and Emily were standing in front of me. They both appeared little and shaky. "You telling him my parents is a low blow?" John stumbled to himself. "Oh, I just reported that we got divorced," I said, determined to face Jan's scowl, but he recoiled from his father's hard stare. Even though I got along well with my in-laws and would often go out to dinner with them when John wasn't there, I felt it would be inappropriate to keep the specifics of our divorce a secret, so I paid them a visit. "Is it true that you're remarrying Emily?" Jan questioned incredulously. "Yes, it's true," I replied, acknowledging the gravity of the information. "Emily, Emma, and I are going to start over as a family." "What topic are you discussing?" John shot back, making his father furrow his brow in frustration. "Your only family is Sarah," John said. "Jan gave me a paper before." Shaking his head, it was a bill from a 5-star hotel nearby. "What's this?" Confused, I asked. John pointed to the bill on the table and said, "It's the bill from the hotel we stayed at," before abruptly falling. "Oh, Mom, what the fuck? I didn't raise you to be like this." My mother-in-law gasped for air, to which Emily and John responded in surprise. "What's causing your anger?" The family dynamic is evolving due to my upcoming marriage and the addition of a grandchild, a blood relative, no less. Are you? Not content, I attempted to reason with them, but my mother-in-law looked at me with a bewildered and disappointed expression. Despite knowing that I wasn't interested in having children, my in-laws continued to treat me like their own daughter. Naturally, they also treated my childhood friend Emily in the same way. However, there was always a line between a friend and a daughter-in-law. I knew my mother-in-law wouldn't be pleased with this circumstance because Emily had a history of complaining about it, and Emily should have known better. Don't you think about Emma, since it will be your grandchild, you must be pleased, am I right? John persisted in an attempt to change their mind. It's because I've known her since she was a young child. Well, but John accounts for half of her blood, correct? I got chills from Emily's apparent lack of understanding and lack of regret. Someone who had been silent up until that point spoke up. It's time to stop, Emma, who had been fiddling with her phone in the corner of the space, said to Emily, "It's disgusting." Not raising her gaze, there was a startled quiet in the room. Regardless of blood relation, the only person I view as such is my father. On the other hand, John has regularly shown up for school functions. Dates of events were frequently overlooked and eventually kept a secret, so Dad would tell him after the fact, but Dad always said I was his daughter. Therefore I'll always be his, Emma firmly said. I will never be yours, staring Emily in the eyes. She sat next to me and her voice became softer. I was afraid you might be resentful when I first heard about this. Dad, though, told me otherwise. Emma, you have my undying love, Sarah said. Your visits during my hospital stay meant the world to me. Tears welling up in her eyes. Emma, she went on, putting her arms around her, it's not that the situation isn't complicated, it's just that I love you. I have raised you as my own child for 15 years, even if you might be the product of John and Emily's affair. George, a fresh presence, entered the room when they were speaking. George spoke up and said, "We knew a decade ago." Addressing Emily, he pointed at the paperwork and said, "Your unilateral divorce request was surprising, especially given that it's not finalized yet. Despite the waiting period, you've chosen to remain my wife, and Emma remains our daughter," said George. But the idea that Emma would pick her parent raised doubts, he firmly said. A 15-year-old can't decide such matters, which caused Emily and Emma to exchange glances. Emma then tightly held Emily's hand. Emily stood speechless, shooting me a glare, but John suddenly erupted into laughter. "Ah, so that's it, you two are together, huh?" He chuckled. "But too bad, isn't it impossible to survive on George's salary alone? Can you stop jumping to conclusions?" I retorted, bemused. "Besides, it seems George earns double what you think," I added, observing John's stunned expression. "Emily knows about it." "Huh, it's probably just a bluff," John dismissed, growing increasingly flustered. "And it's impossible for you to work while dealing with your illness. You'll just waste away somewhere," he concluded, with a hint of smugness. I chuckled at John's misconceptions, and John, noticing my amusement, began to laugh too. "You had no idea about my income, did you?" John retorted. "It's probably just a bit more than a part-time job," John insisted, his eyes widening in disbelief. "It's different," I replied, stating the obvious. "My annual income is $500,000. John's expression fell, and Emily's was as well. "In actuality, I've gained popularity as a children's book author for the last 10 years. Essays, interviews, and other work have increased my income tremendously," I said, feeling pleased. "In addition, a movie adaptation is being developed, so my income is soaring." Liar. John gave a startled exclamation. "Oh, you want proof?" I made a joke and showed Emily my bank account screen, which prominently showed large monthly deposits. Emily was speechless, and I took advantage of the moment. "Sarah, let's try to make things right," I said, holding out my hand. "What are you saying?" Emily lost her temper, her rage evident. Disregarding John's remarks, I grasped Emma's hand and said goodbye to my in-laws. Departing from their residence, John used to work for my father-in-law's business, but it was soon discovered that he was lying about his whereabouts, and as a result, he was let go. My father-in-law planned to punish him by making him work non-stop on a friend's fishing boat, but fishing life was hard on the indoorsy John, and though he tried to contact me, I told my father-in-law every time, so eventually I stopped his calls. Emily filed for divorce after George was granted custody of her children. John seemed unambitious and couldn't afford luxury, so she didn't show any interest in him. She eventually lost her family's support and was forced to live alone in a rundown apartment. She had not worked since her marriage and had been dependent on others to take care of her necessities. For Emily, she found herself unable to manage tasks independently, and opportunities for full-time employment were scarce. Nevertheless, she had to cover her living expenses and child support, so she juggled multiple part-time jobs, barely making ends meet. Meanwhile, when Emma progressed into high school, she dedicated herself to diligent studies, aspiring to pursue higher education abroad at a prestigious university. Her ultimate dream was to translate my picture books and share them with children worldwide, a prospect that brought me immense joy. On my end, my picture books continued to enjoy strong sales, with increasing interest in adaptations and merchandise. Despite my ongoing battle with illness, there has been progress, and my doctor recently hinted at the possibility of leaving the hospital next year. Moreover, George and Emma faithfully visit me every day. George, in particular, has expressed his intentions of remarrying, a proposal that has left me pondering. While I haven't yet given him an answer, I find myself developing feelings for him. He envisions a future where we live together once I'm discharged, and amidst these deliberations, I find solace in pouring myself into my work, crafting stories with the hope of a bright future ahead. That's all about the first story, and now let's watch another similar story. David grinned and replied, "I'd do anything for a good life," exuding confidence in himself. He was nice at first, but now he looked more like a shallow little villain, with a nasty taste in my mouth. His every motion was oozing with deception when he proudly displayed a business card, clearly confident in his newfound financial comfort. Had this been the person I was thinking of marrying all along, I couldn't help but notice the irony of his changed name after joining the family. So I reluctantly accepted the business card for his real estate company. I was much more uneasy because I recognized his last name and the business name that was inscribed next to it. It seems that our paths were now destined to intersect frequently. What a shame, he bemoaned, indicating that he wanted to have no more interactions. When I gave him my own business card, the tables turned and I saw his face become pale. I'm Jessica Owen, and I'm 45 years old. The story I'm going to tell you started around 3 years ago. I had experimented in matchmaking for a short while at the time, motivated by curiosity and supportive from people around me. It didn't matter if marriage was in my future. The excitement of making new friends was reward enough. David Thompson, a charming young man with a taste for older ladies, was one of these acquaintances. David looked well put together, his tamed brown hair perfectly styled, and he had an older-than-actual sense of elegance about him, with a soft and friendly demeanor. He expressed his preference for encouraging ambitious partners over pursuing his own career, which was a refreshing change from the workaholics I was used to. His attentiveness was charming, and our chats were calming. I became accustomed to anticipating our meetings and unwittingly succumbed to his allure, but he started exhibiting symptoms of discomfort, such as his insistence on receiving treatment when we went on dates. David grinned broadly and got up, ignoring the bill, after our dates. Lunch and chat at the restaurant were over. I was taken aback by his behavior. I didn't mind taking care of him even though I made more money and he was nearly 10 years younger, but I thought he should at least pretend to grab his wallet. Did I have the wrong expectation? His attitude of taking things for granted irritated me more than his refusal to pay. I asked people nearby for their thoughts since I was uncomfortable, and I got conflicting answers. While some thought it was normal for the guy to treat, others contended that the one making more should just pay and be satisfied. Going Dutch feels much clearer, doesn't it? Was even put forth by someone. One viewpoint struck a chord with me. I ought to bring up the matter openly with the person I might eventually marry. We wouldn't want to bottle up these emotions if we were thinking about starting a family. which is why I chose to face David. You are aware that, for the most part, I have paid. I would prefer us to go Dutch or alternate paying from now on. How do you feel? I posed the question to him directly. David looked surprised for a second. He cleared his throat, seemingly considering his answer carefully. He then expressed his heartfelt regret and clarified that, in men, it is traditional to show respect to someone who is older or in a higher position. He acknowledged that he had misunderstood the circumstances and pledged to set things right. From now on, I'll be sure to offer to pay. In fact, treating others with pride is a frequent practice among the older guys I know, he remarked after hearing his explanation in full. We decided to split the cost going forward, but there was still a feeling of injustice. We'd go to nice restaurants, movies, and museums when it was my turn to pay. However, when David's turn came, our outings would usually wind up at less expensive locations like parks and cafes. Maybe it was just a question of personal taste. I was ready to express my uneasiness when David apologized ahead of time. I apologize, but when it comes time for me to pay, I can't take you to fancier places. This is the best I can do due to my limited income, he said, looking downcast as he showed me his bank book. I was perfectly okay with it and felt like I could forgive him. Ultimately, my goal was to select a mate based on our compatibility rather than their financial standing. In fact, his thoughtful actions elevated my opinion of him. Compatibility is the most important factor. We'd been dating for 2 months when I made the decision to commit to David. Weekend visits with David had become a regular feature of my schedule. That day, I saw the bench where we had agreed to meet and grinned. As I arrived at our meeting place almost 10 minutes early, I was relieved that David had also arrived early, since I assumed he was excited about it. I was so excited that I thought I would sneak up on him and surprise him, but when I got closer, David's phone rang. I didn't want to interrupt, but I heard David answer the phone in a laid-back manner. Hey, no way, it's my day with the elderly woman today. Yes. Let's catch up later, he responded, cutting the call abruptly and giving off the impression that he was tired. The term day with the old lady really disturbed me, and I had a sneaking suspicion that he meant the day we were meeting. I slipped away from the scene and had a cold coffee to calm me while I considered whether to approach him. I apologized for being late and arrived back at the meeting spot 5 minutes beyond our allocated time. David gave a nice smile. Don't worry, I just got here too, he replied, grinning pitifully after bringing up work. You're busy with work, aren't you? It seems like he really wants to see me. I couldn't help but question if the previous occurrence was simply miscommunication. I smiled tentatively and we carried on as usual with our date. It was David's time to pay today, and he recommended an exceptionally fancy restaurant. David's automobile took us to the restaurant, where we were seated at a rather private table. As we settled in, it appeared that he had booked a reservation, an unusual event. David straightened up and suddenly felt uneasy. For the past 2 months, Jessica, I've looked forward to spending every weekend with you. I'm starting to wish we could see each other every day. Would you marry me, if you're cool with it? The proposal came as a surprise. I was so happy that I forgot my earlier suspicions for a little while. I'm grateful. That would be a privilege. Thus, we got engaged. This, of course, meant quitting the dating service. The next week, as we approached marriage, we went to look at rings together. For now, it was simply window shopping, but I recall being really happy when we drove back. During our automobile ride, we talked about our future. We must also choose a time for us to meet each other's parents. It's going to be hectic, I hummed as I stretched, and David concurred. David drove, while I sat in the passenger seat. This arrangement has grown fairly accustomed to me. Even though I was getting excited and nervous about the future, I didn't worry too much at the time because I thought we could support one another through it all. You're so preoccupied with work, Jessica. It must be quite difficult for you. I've always respected your level of dedication. I want to be the kind of husband who helps you with that. I wouldn't mind being a stay-at-home husband if that's all right with you. David talked upbeat about what lay ahead, his happy profile, where he joked about becoming a stay-at-home husband. Seemed wonderful. I couldn't hold back my laughter. I'm planning to quit my job after we get married, but we'll be okay financially, I said. David looked at me, clearly taken aback, and with that, he fell silent. Though he usually insisted on spending longer time with me, he left early today. I had initially found David's behavior strange, but I wasn't sure what was going on. Then he experienced an astonishing metamorphosis. Every time I proposed getting together, he would make thin pretexts about being sick or busy. I was excited to start scheduling and introduce our families because our wedding was approaching, but David came across as evasive and uninterested. I was really concerned because even when we did get to meet, his mind seemed to be elsewhere. Then, abruptly, he called it quits, saying he could no longer see himself getting married to me. It happened without warning at the cafe he'd invited me to, a place we frequently visited together. I was shocked by his abrupt shift in attitude. I was persuaded to ask him to explain why he was backtracking on his suggestion, but I was met with silence, with tears running down my cheeks. David cruelly told me he was getting married to someone else and laughed at me. I was left broken, trying to process the destruction of our broken relationship. Notifying loved ones and friends was a difficult process, as their incredulity reflected my own. I was so exhausted and devoid of feeling that I was unable to hold David accountable or even envision my life without him. I came to the painful understanding that maybe marriage wasn't meant for me, and I shared it with everyone around me. My recuperation was hindered for more than a year by the anguish I felt from David's abandonment. I eventually decided that I would never again consider getting married. The sting of his departure had subsided into a seething rage and disdain. 5 years after he unilaterally ended our engagement unexpectedly, I crossed paths with David again. It was at a charity event hosted by a local non-profit organization, an occasion initially meant for my father, who had fallen ill. When I navigated the crowd, assuming his duties, I caught sight of a familiar figure that made my breath catch in my throat. It was David. He was nestled comfortably beside a noticeably younger woman, their laughter filling the air. It struck me how different he appeared, content and carefree. I recalled his past assertions of a preference for older women, which only fueled my indignation when I observed them together. Despite my displeasure, our eyes briefly locked before I made a deliberate move to engage with someone else. To my annoyance, David approached me, his once refreshing smile now contorted into an irritating grin. "Hey, long time no see, what are you doing here?" he inquired, his tone lacking any semblance of sincerity. I recoiled in disgust, exhaling heavily. "Can you not talk to me?" "I'm busy," I retorted, unable to hide my disdain. "Your tastes have really changed, haven't they? Weren't you into older women?" David's laughter grated on my nerves when he advanced, disregarding my obvious discomfort. "I never really liked older women," he confessed in a low voice, his tone dripping with disdain. "I hated the idea of being with an old lady. I just thought it made sense because older women have money." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, recalling his previous references to old ladies during our conversations. The derogatory manner in which he used the term fueled my frustration, and I clenched my teeth in anger. While I wasn't particularly vain about my age, the contempt with which he spoke stung deeply. "I'll do anything for a good life. That's why I married the daughter of a real estate agent," David boasted, walking away with a self-satisfied smirk. The man I once thought decent now seemed nothing more than a petty villain, willing to discard decency for financial gain. When he flicked a business card towards me with exaggerated flair, every movement felt pretentious, leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. If David could alter his persona so drastically, perhaps he should have pursued a career in acting instead of seeking a wealthy match. I watched him depart, his chin held high in arrogance. Feeling a wave of nausea wash over me, I reluctantly accepted the business card, noting the surname changed to Johnson, evidently adopting his wife's surname. The name rang a bell, as did the company listed, Johnson Real Estate. Without bothering to check his position, I handed the card back. "Unfortunately, it looks like we'll be seeing each other monthly." "What a shame. I was hoping I'd never have to see you again," I remarked, passing him another business card, this one bearing my father's name. David's confusion was palpable as he mumbled, "Wait, does this mean you're related to?" I interrupted, elucidating the connection. "That's my father. He couldn't make it today, but you're lucky. He probably wouldn't want to see you anyway. My family owns a significant amount of land. We're what you'd call major landowners, with assets possibly worth around $20 million. I clarified that my previous mention of quitting my job after marriage was due to our substantial passive income, not out of necessity. Working at a company was purely my choice. Post-marriage, I intended to assist my father in our land management business. In essence, by ending things with me, David missed out on a far grander opportunity than he could have fathomed. When David processed the revelation, I couldn't contain my laughter. The prospect of discussing my family's wealth during formal introductions had been in the cards all along. While David was aware of my job, he had no inkling of my family's fortune. "We've entrusted Johnson Real Estate with some of our properties lately," I continued, explaining my involvement in land management and transactions on behalf of my father. Despite my reluctance, it seemed I would have to encounter David monthly. His shock wasn't solely due to my family's wealth, but the realization of the missed opportunity he had overlooked in my family. Land ownership isn't just a matter of possession. We also engage in property development, constructing apartments and buildings on our land. Johnson Real Estate is one of our business partners, though they're just one of several familiar companies we collaborate with. We maintain flexibility and could switch to another company if needed. However, for Johnson Real Estate, our family represents a significant landlord whose departure could jeopardize their operations. Observing David's pale expression, I contained my rising irritation, anticipating his reaction. Instead of the expected protest, David surprised me. "So that's how it is. Well, I'm thrilled we'll continue our association. It seems fate has brought us together," he remarked, his attitude shifting as he attempted to ingratiate himself with me. His shamelessness was astounding, seemingly possessing a skin thickness of about 15 feet. I intervened, unable to tolerate his audacity. "Please stop. How can you speak of fate? After behaving so despicably, it's repulsive," I expressed with a frown, signaling my rejection. However, David persisted, trailing after me. "Wait, my princess, our encounter must be fate, right? You once held feelings for me. It's not too late to revert to how things were," he insisted, his comments growing increasingly offensive, hindering my interaction with other important individuals. Determined to escalate the situation, I called for assistance. "Help, please, I'm being followed. Can someone please remove this man?" Peter Johnson, David's father-in-law and the president of Johnson Real Estate, rushed over in alarm. Witnessing his son-in-law's inappropriate behavior was naturally concerning. Having already greeted Mr. Johnson, he recognized me and intervened. "Step back, David. I deeply apologize." Mr. Johnson scolded his son-in-law before turning to me for an explanation. As I recounted the incident, David's wife, Mandy, also arrived. I had heard of her during my conversation with Mr. Johnson. Observing her reaction, I noticed her shock upon learning about David's actions. However, her response was unexpected. "I'm seriously inconvenienced. Please don't approach me in front of everyone," I firmly instructed David, emphasizing my disdain for his persistent advances. As I distanced myself, I prayed that Mr. Johnson would make sure that David and I never saw each other again. A call from my family's residence arrived a few days later. Someone called Mandy had come looking for me, crying uncontrollably. When I hurried home, I discovered that the woman was, predictably, Mandy Johnson, David's wife. She attempted to speak with David after I left, but he refused to listen and left the location, running away from both Mandy and his father-in-law. Then, yesterday, he came home and demanded a divorce out of the blue. It was while he was listening to Mandy's moving narrative that he said he met his soulmate. Hoping that I wasn't his soulmate, I steeled myself. Mandy had no idea who this individual was. Mandy came to me in desperation, grasping at straws. After hearing via the grapevine of my last abrupt abandonment, I didn't know you and David were previously engaged. Mandy sobbed as she offered her apology. The other day, my friends and family were also present at the charity function. They were familiar with the story even though they didn't know David's face. Mandy had surely heard from someone. No, you share equal victimhood with him as I did. Don't feel the need to apologize, I reassured Mandy. Seeing someone so much younger than myself in tears was devastating, with no bitterness toward her and just sympathy for her. David's actions, which caused harm to an innocent woman, became even more inexcusable. Are you aware of David's current location? This is really bad, unforgivable, I responded, honestly not knowing. I shrugged. After some time of contemplation, it dawned on me, David most likely desired a reconciliation with me, considering his recent actions. Maybe he would be delighted to hear from me on my cell phone. I was so mad at him for breaking up with me so quickly that I blocked his number. I unblocked him immediately, got ready, and dialed David. Predictably enough, fell for the ruse right away. Hi there, Jessica. I'm so glad you've forgiven me. I had to hold back on my need to yell at him to stop spouting gibberish. I forced a sigh out of me and spoke. Is it possible for us to meet? I'd like to speak. It's at my parents' house. David's voice got even louder when I stated a family home, probably because he thought I was going to introduce him to my rich parents. Of course, my parents despised David so much they wouldn't want him in their sight. You have my affection. I will come get you immediately. I mean, you were waiting for me, right? We simply lacked maturity, but we can return to our previous state of affairs if you would pardon me. After all, David's self-deluded babbling made me flinch in disgust and remove the phone from my ear. We are destined lovers. After all, unable to hear the call, Mandy glanced nervously at me. I signaled to her that everything was going as planned and gave her the thumbs up. Mandy, can you call your father right now? I spoke to her in a whisper. She bit her lip, fighting back tears, and nodded. I hung up after telling David the location and time. It was time to prepare the scene now. An hour later, David foolishly went to my family's house, unaware of the trap that had been prepared. He was virtually dancing when I opened the door. He stepped inside the house and said, Jessica, I didn't keep you waiting, did I? David was met with an enraged Mr. Johnson and a sobbing Mandy, which caused him to freeze in disbelief. David, what kind of betrayal is this to Mandy? Thus, from the beginning, everything was about the money. Mr. Johnson chastised him. Pale as a ghost, David stumbled back. But there was nowhere to run. I stopped the way out. In a sense, I am waiting for you to finally put an end to the matter. Furthermore, I find it impossible to let the past go. For your unilaterally ending our engagement, I'll be suing you for damages, I said. When David heard my announcement, he started to shake with confusion. He staggered deeper into the house, directly in the direction of Mandy and Mr. Johnson. This is very awful. You have never shown me affection. You have my forgiveness. We're divorcing, and I'll be pursuing payment as well. With sobs, Mandy threw her handkerchief at David. David fell on the ground when Mr. Johnson gave his weeping daughter a bare embrace and glared at him. David pleaded with me, one more chance, Jessica. I'm not giving up. If he believed there was even the slightest possibility, he was sadly mistaken. We're never going to get back together. You are hated by me. I made myself known by saying, as softly as I could, I never want to share the same room, air with you again. David was perspiring heavily. Now was the time to get past any regrets. David heard Mandy stop crying for a moment. And then he said something. I should have just settled with the Johnson, he said in a voice that was barely audible in the unexpected quiet, yet it was heard by everybody. Startled by what he said, I observed Mr. Johnson respond first. What did you just say? Mr. Johnson confronted David for his impolite remark, his voice filled with wrath. David pushed past me and hurried outside, falling as he went. Virtually jumping with dread, I was dumbfounded as to how someone could become so pathetic and could only stare after him. Mr. Johnson angrily said, back to reality, and dragged us back inside. we took out our cell phones, having captured David's ignominious behavior on camera. The first phone call was, of course, also recorded. When David ran away, we took immediate action. I will undoubtedly be demanding payment for being abruptly dropped. How about you? I asked Mandy and Mr. Johnson. Both of them gave a nod of assent. We started talks and got ready to legally corner David that same day. First off, considering how abrupt and ridiculous the split was, my request for payment was definitely approved. I was so tired of him by the time we split up that I didn't even have the strength to sue him. The engagement had ended nearly within the statute of limitations. At 2.5 years, David's mistake upon our reconnection was of great assistance. David had left all of his bank records and other documents at his in-laws' house before fleeing, so the Johnson family was well prepared. And his financial status was almost public knowledge. We won the case after months of preparation and litigation. David attempted to avoid paying by stating he was broke, but ultimately he had to pay back every last cent. David appeared to be more likely to spend than to conserve. He had spent all of his resources, but even so, it was insufficient to pay Mandy and me what we owed. David disappeared from our hometown, refusing to pay extra. For many years, my family has been well-known landowners. With a lot of power, living here would be impossible for him after such an encounter. However, it went beyond that. David essentially vanished. His whereabouts remained a mystery. Even after reaching out to his relatives, they had severed relations from the beginning out of fear of my family's reprisals. Well, that's all behind us now. I'm glad I'm not stuck staring at his face any longer. 2 years after we got back together, I can only remember seeing David once. It happened when I saw reports of a big park being cleared of homeless people. A glimpse of David appeared on the edge of the TV screen. I looked twice, but he was gone too soon for me to be certain, though it might have been someone else. If David was the victim, it seemed like a fitting conclusion for someone who pursued luxury at the expense of other people's sentiments. It has been a few years since then. It surprised me that I'm married now. My friends and parents were taken aback by my earlier remark that I was against marriage. Let me introduce you to my spouse, Peter Johnson, who was briefly David's father-in-law. Although we had first met in the land development industry, Mr. Johnson and I become close after siding with David. It would be amazing if I could live out the rest of my days with you. Jessica, would you be interested in dating me? I still recall his timid downward glance, followed by a profound bow. Following the death of his wife in an accident more than 10 years prior, Mr. Johnson was a single father. Our friendship grew out of this experience, which brought us an unanticipated connection and swiftly led to marriage. Even if I was previously distant from marriage, things happen quickly when it comes time. It's amusing how erratic fate can be. I can confidently entrust my father to your care, remarked Mandy, who is now my stepdaughter. At first, Mandy and I got along because we were both upset by David. But as we got to know one another better, that history faded, and I now love Mandy as a friend as much as a daughter. Being the only kid, I had concerns about how I would handle my inheritance when I became older. That was one of the reasons I tried my hand at matchmaking, but I have Mandy now. She's a good kid, even though she can be a bit of an airhead, and I feel confident leaving everything to her. Still, I'm hoping she finds a trustworthy companion. Mandy is currently looking for love once more with the hopes of getting married a second time. I'm hopeful that this time, in addition to my amazing husband, Mandy will find someone genuinely special. Above is today's story. If you like it, please subscribe and give it a thumbs up. See you next time.